everyone, Professor Davis here, and we are going to talk about ecosystems and the biosphere in this set of videos. And so to start with this, I do have a picture here that kind of shows you the different types of ecosystems or biomes that are present on land. So those would be the terrestrial biomes. We're going to talk about some ecosystem characteristics in general first, talking about energy and cycles like the carbon cycle, the water cycle, that kind of thing. And then part 2 is going to focus more on characteristics of the biomes. So taking a look at ecosystems, guys, remember that ecosystems contain both the biotic components and the abiotic components. Remember that bio means life, so the biotic components are the living things, whereas the abiotic are going to be the non-living. Remember when you put a or an in front of the word, it means without. So if bio means life, if we put an a in front of it, that's without life. Now, ecosystems are characterized by how the energy kind of flows through the ecosystem, as well as the chemical cycles that are present in the ecosystem. So abiotic components are going to be things like the soil, water, sunlight, temperature, wind. It could also be the precipitation that's present. Okay, so there's a lot of different things that can fall into that category of non-living. On the living side, the biotic components, these are going to be divided into your producers and your consumers. Your producers are the autotrophs. They're the ones who can make their own food. In the land biomes, these are going to be mostly the photosynthesizers. Now, this is also true in some of your water biomes when we still have sunlight present. When you go to the deep ocean, though, we do see that the producers are not going to do photosynthesis. They're going to do chemiosynthesis. Now, these producers and the ones who do photosynthesis are going to be plants, cyanobacteria, and algae. Consumers, on the other hand, are heterotrophs. These guys are going to obtain food from others. They're going to either do this by absorbing their nutrients or ingesting it like we do. Depending on what their focus is and what they consume, determines kind of the subgroup that they're part of. So if they're herbivores, they're plant eaters. Okay, they're going to eat plants. We also have carnivores. Carnivores eat meat. Omnivores, they're going to eat plants and meat, so they eat both. Decomposers or dentivores are going to feed on dead material. We also have scavengers that fit into this group who are going to eat on dead material as well, but this is the material they didn't kill. We do see consumers that are the carnivores, that are predators, are going to kill their prey, but scavengers are going to be eating the dead material. When we also look at some of these groups, especially like the herbivore group, we can have kind of subgroups underneath that. If they only eat fruit, they're called fructivores. In the carnivore area, if they only eat insects, they're called insectivores. And so we can be more specific, but these are the kind of broad categories that I'd like you to know. So let's talk a little bit about energy flow and chemical cycling. So energy flow relies on the producers. This is their ability to absorb solar energy. So all energy on planet Earth comes ultimately from the sun. And the producers are the ones who can access that energy directly by performing photosynthesis. And so they're really important because they are the ones who can absorb that and put it into the system. So when we look at kind of this progression of energy, we see it goes from the sun to the producers, then to the consumers. All right, so sun, autotrophs, heterotrophs. Now, this does bring us to a little bit of physics where we're going to talk about the 2 laws of thermodynamics. So the first law is where energy cannot be created nor destroyed. All right. It can be transformed, however. We can change it from one type to another. So we can change it from solar energy into chemical energy. Okay, so from sunlight into sugars. And we can then also change it from chemical energy into kinetic energy. All right, so we can transform it, we can change it, but we can't create it and we can't destroy it. That's what the first law says. The second law, on the other hand, is where energy transformations result in some of the energy in that transformation process is going to be converted to heat. Now, heat is not a usable form of energy. Now, for us, we can use a little bit of it to heat our internal body temperatures, but for the most part, a lot of the heat is going to be given off. It's not usable. All right, kind of think about it with your car. You put the gas in, the gas goes from chemical energy to kinetic energy, your car's moving, but after you've driven it a while, your hood gets hot, the engine gets warm, and this is because some of that energy in that conversion is converted into heat. So this means that ecosystems have to have a constant input of energy because it flows through it. Okay, we can't recycle it. And so because of this, you have to have a constant input. And this is again why the sun is so important. Okay, because most energy gets transformed into heat, which dissipates into the environment and is not usable. So if we take a look here, this is kind of just a pictorial view. You can see that energy flows through the system. You see that in the red where it flows through, whereas nutrients can be recycled. Okay, so nutrients can be recycled like carbon, nitrogen, water, that kind of stuff. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of these cycles in a little bit. We do see that inputs for these ecosystems are the energy itself and the nutrients. Both are required. Now let's talk about a generalized nutrient cycling. When we look at this, nutrients are going to flow in particular orders. We do see here in the middle in the yellow box, it says that the nutrients enter the food chain. These are normally going to be made available by the producers. So you see the arrow going towards the producers. These nutrients may come from an abiotic reservoir. This abiotic reservoir may be linked to a geological process like erosion, or it could be the water cycle or something like that. But we do see that it enters into the food chain through the producers. The producers then are going to be eaten by the consumers, and so we see the transfer of these nutrients from the producers to the consumers. Now, not all of this is going to be transported to the consumers. Some of it will be transported to the decomposers or even returned back to the abiotic reservoir when the plant dies or when it loses some of its leaves or whatever might happen, and recycling is going to take place. But you'll notice that this is, even though it's not just a circle around like this for recycling, it's a little more convoluted than that. You can see though that it's going to be a cycle. Decomposers are a big part of this in helping return the nutrients back into the cycle, whether it's directly back to the plants or back to the abiotic reservoir. So decomposition is key. So with chemical cycles, we do rely on the producer's ability to acquire these inorganic nutrients. These inorganic nutrients are going to be things like chnops, so carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur. And they're going to have to be able to get these from their physical environment. When they do, they want to be able to convert them into organic nutrients like carbohydrates, proteins, fats, nucleic acids, but they've got to be able to get it from the environment. And so with the producers, a lot of times this is going to come from the soil, okay? Now, once it gets into the cycle and it goes from the autotrophs or producers, it will move to the heterotrophs because those producers are going to be consumed by them. Decomposers are going to break things down and return the inorganics back into the reservoir. They may also give access directly back to the plants, okay, the producers. So ecosystems must be efficient at this recycling, otherwise the biosystem isn't going to be sustained. Okay, this is also what determines how well the soil is able to have diversity of plants and even animals in the area of a biome, is a lot of times how well that they can recycle these chemicals. Now, with this movement of nutrients, we do see that these are going to be pictured in food webs or chains, as well as what we call ecological pyramids. So let's talk about a food web first. The webs illustrate feeding relationships. So who eats who? Okay, when we're looking at this. It also represents the path of the energy flow. Now, this web means that it's going to be all over the place, okay? That things might get eaten by multiple stuff. We might see that the top predator eats multiple things, but it's going to be a couple of food chains put together. So food chains are a little more simple. They usually have 3 to 4 links to them, and they seldom have 5 that are present. But if we put them into more of a food web, it can become more complex. So if you take a look here, this is a basic type of food chain where you have your producer. It's going to be the base of the food chain, the primary consumer, the secondary consumer, and then the tertiary consumer. Example of this would be the oak tree. The oak tree, the leaves are going to be eaten by the caterpillar. The caterpillar gets eaten by the bird, and the bird gets eaten by the hawk. Okay, so there is a progression that takes place. Now, food webs can overlap, and so we can see that here in this picture. So if you look here, we have multiple food chains that are present, but if you'll notice, some of these can overlap, or one organism might be in several food chains, and they may not even be in the same level in each of the food chains. Sometimes they might be the primary consumer. Other times they might be the secondary consumer. It depends on the chain, right? But this just shows you that there are multiple ways when animals have a variety of food to choose from, that this is going to be a more convoluted process. Now, ecological pyramids are a little different. These are a diagram used to describe the number, the biomass, or energy flow at each trophic level. So producers, primary consumers, secondary consumers, and the tertiary. And they form this like triangle pyramid type structure. The trophic levels are composed of organisms that occupy that same position in the food chain or web. So just like we saw in the web though, sometimes they might be able to be primary or secondary consumers. In an ecological pyramid, we just pick one place for them to go. They may only be part of the primary consumer, or they may only be part of the secondary consumer. So these guys are kind of a little more limiting than the food webs are. But if we use the ecological pyramid, we do see that there is a loss of energy between each level in the food chain. Now, this isn't energy that's lost and destroyed. Remember, this is energy that has been converted into heat and is no longer usable. And so at the very bottom, you see that you have the producers being able to access the energy from the sun. Then you have some of that energy being transported to the primary consumers, then the secondary, and then the tertiary. If you notice, it's only about 10%. Only about 10% moves to each level. This is not very efficient, but this is why it makes a pyramid. Because if we're losing that usable energy, we can only feed fewer animals at the higher levels. So your tertiary consumers, the top dogs of the food chain, there's not going to be very many of them. They can't sustain a huge number because we see less and less of what they eat as we move up. All right, and so these pyramids are more generalized, but we do see that they can be useful. So a general rule is that only about 10% of energy or biomass is transferred to each level. Each trophic level is typically smaller than the preceding one. And the reason why is we see waste and excretion takes place. So some energy is consumed that's used for maintenance and not for reproduction. And so we see that the numbers are less as you move up. Again, some problems with these pyramids is because they are more limiting. If you notice, there was no place to put the detrivores or the decomposers. Okay, the ones who eat the dead material, they're not in the pyramid. We also see, where do you put the omnivores? If they can be at multiple levels, they eat plants and they eat animals, where do they go in these pyramids? Some of the biomass pyramids get inverted. They're backwards. That means the ecosystem, though, is out of whack, and we've got a problem that is occurring. And it does oversimplify the concept of how energy flows through the system, right? But we can still use them for some general information. So let's talk about some of these biogeochemical cycles. Whoa, that's a mouthful. So bio is the living, geo is the geology, that's the abiotic factors, and then of course chemicals is some chemistry. So how do these all fit together? Well, this involves the cycling of chemicals between the geological or abiotic side with the biology biotic community. Now, when we look at these cycles, guys, there are 3 things always present. These include the reservoir, the exchange pool, and the biotic community. Now, the reservoir, pool, and community may be different depending on which cycle we're looking at, but they have these three basic components. You'll notice in this particular chart, you'll see the reservoir, exchange pool, and biotic communities have arrows that go back and forth between them. You'll see the biotic community is also showing you the producers, the consumers, and the decomposers, because this is a cycle. And we also see that human activity can affect this, all right? And normally it does not affect these in a positive way. So let's talk about some of these cycles. Some of these cycles include things like the hydrologic cycle or the water cycle. We see the carbon, the nitrogen, and the phosphorus. So some concepts with these cycles are that the biogeochemical cycles help rid waste. Okay, so they're going to help get rid of the waste and recycle the parts that are needed in the ecosystem. Human activities, not limited to releasing excess pollutants, disrupt these guys. We not only pollute things, but sometimes we disrupt these by doing things like removing too much of the biomass of the plants or too much of the biomass of the animals. Like if we overhunt areas, we can end up messing up some of these chemical cycles. Now, this can threaten the quality of health and the biodiversity in the ecosystem. So we have to be careful about our impact that we have here. So let's generally look at some of these cycles. You do not have to memorize every part of them, but I do want you to look at the three parts, right? I want you to look at the reservoir. I want you to look at the exchange, like where does it enter into the food chain or the actual side there, and then how do we return it back? Okay, so this is the idea of cycling. And these are found in kind of a little box to the side in each of these diagrams. So if you look here at the water cycle itself, we do see that this is something you have learned way, way back when you were young, okay? So when you were a kid, you learned this in some of your basic science classes. My fourth grader is learning about the water cycle right now in her science class. And so if you look here, you do see that the abiotic reservoir is the surface and atmospheric water. So the water that's on the surface like lakes, runoff, oceans, the groundwater table like aquifers, as well as the water that's in the air, so your clouds and that sort of thing. How does it enter into the food chain? Well, when we see precipitation happen, plants take it up by their roots and the water then enters in, okay? And this is where it gets used in lots of different ways. We can recycle it through plants with transpiration. You can see that that's where water gets lost by the plant into the atmosphere. We also see that these oceans, lakes, the runoff stuff can also be evaporated into the air as well. This returns it back to where it makes clouds, then it rains again, and so on. We then have the carbon cycle. If we look at the carbon cycle here, the abiotic reservoir here is the CO2 in the atmosphere. So the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is where most of this carbon is going to come from. It enters the food chain in photosynthesis. So if you'll recall, photosynthesis requires carbon dioxide, water, and light. Okay, so carbon dioxide is the plant going to absorb that from the atmosphere and use it in order to create sugar and oxygen. How can this also be recycled is, well, decomposing bacteria and fungi are going to put the carbon dioxide back up. It also can return to the abiotic community through respiration, like from us breathing. Okay, so any organisms who then do cellular respiration, which means we take in oxygen, we take in food, and we convert it into carbon dioxide and water, we're putting that carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. All right, and so you can see again here at the cycle, we also do this by returning it by burning things like fossil fuels, coal, gas, all that kind of stuff is going to go back into the atmosphere. The next one is the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle here, the abiotic reservoir is nitrogen in the atmosphere. So unlike what we saw with the water cycle and what we saw with the carbon dioxide cycle, plants cannot use this directly. They can use the water and the carbon dioxide directly. They can absorb it and they can use it. Nitrogen is not one of those things they can just absorb. And so in order for it to enter the food chain, you're going to notice a key component here. Nitrogen fixation has to happen in the soil, and this is done by bacteria. Bacteria is really important in the nitrogen cycle. If you look in the picture, you see bacteria in multiple levels of this. Okay, decomposing and nitrifying bacteria help with this. Denitrifying bacteria goes back into the process of returning it to the air. Bacteria is key. So if you don't remember anything about the nitrogen cycle, remember that bacteria plays a huge role in it. Okay, and this is where we do see that those special types of roots with those root nodules with bacteria are helpful to be able to get this nitrogen out of the soil into the plants. That way it can enter into the food chain. The last cycle here we're going to talk about is the phosphorus cycle. In this particular cycle, we do see that the abiotic reservoir comes from rocks, minerals, and the soil. It enters the food chain through the geological process of erosion. This allows that the phosphorus to break off and be soluble so that plants can actually take it up and use it. How do we get it back into the actual reservoir or exchange? We can see decomposing bacteria and fungi are important, as well as sometimes it gets lost to the ocean as sediment, and we'll see that it gets recycled in that key area in the ocean ecosystems. All right, and so sometimes it's down there in those cases. And so phosphorus cycle is here. The recycling is going to be through geological processes, getting it into the soil, and plants being able to use it directly. Bacteria and fungus are also important. And again, this is why decomposers are such a big part of these recycling processes. All right, the last thing I want to talk to you about in this video is the mature ecosystems versus human ecosystems. When humans get involved in the ecosystem, we do disrupt it a lot. And so if we look at a more natural, mature ecosystem, their food chains and their food webs are more complex. In a human ecosystem where we become present, we see that the food chains become shorter. Natural ecosystems tend to have a constant population size, but in human ecosystems, we increase ourselves. And in this process of increasing ourselves, our presence, we are going to hinder and hurt these ecosystems. A natural ecosystem also is used more for maintenance, but human ecosystems, we want to grow. We want more stuff, we want more things, and so because of that, the growth and the use of resources increases greatly. Natural ecosystems are also very efficient at recycling. We are not, okay? Even in communities where recycling is really pushed, there's fines if you don't do it and all that kind of stuff, it's poor at best. Okay, and so because of this, we see that we consume way more of the nutrients in the stuff that we need, and we're not efficient at the recycling process. Natural ecosystems dependent on outside resources? No, they're not. But as humans, we are. We are dependent on lots of outside resources. Okay, and again, this can disrupt the biodiversity of the biomes and the communities that we live in and are a part of. Okay. So this ends the first part of the introduction into our ecology and biomes. The second part will focus more on the biomes and their actual characteristics. If you have any questions, please let me know.